On the 7th of March, 1943, beneath the steel-gray skies of occupied France, Luftwaffe Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller squinted through the oil-streaked canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190 as an unfamiliar silhouette screamed past him at an impossible speed. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt, that massive American fighter his intelligence briefings had dismissed as a flying milk jug, had just outrun his interceptor by what felt like 50 miles per hour. Müller's hands tightened on the control stick, his knuckles white with frustration. He'd been Germany's third highest-scoring ace in the Normandy sector. But in that moment, watching the Thunderbolt's distinctive tail shrink to a dot on the horizon, he felt the ground shifting beneath the Reich's aerial superiority. The German High Command had grossly underestimated what American engineering could achieve. When intelligence reports first arrived in Berlin during the autumn of 1942, describing a new American fighter weighing 7 tons, nearly double that of the nimble Messerschmitt 109, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had laughed openly during staff meetings at the Wolfschanze. How could such a bloated aircraft possibly compete with Germany's refined, battle-tested fighters? The answer arrived not through superior airframe design, but through an innovation so deceptively simple that German engineers would spend months trying to replicate it. The paddle blade propeller. According to declassified documents from the United States Army Air Force's archives, referenced extensively in aviation historian Warren Body's comprehensive work, Republic's P-47 Thunderbolt, From Seversky to Victory, the transformation of the Thunderbolt from a capable but unremarkable fighter into a 470-mile-per-hour monster began with a Piccoli. Our observation at Republic Aviation's Farmingdale facility on Long Island. Alexander Kartveli, the brilliant Georgian-born chief engineer who had designed the Thunderbolt, noticed something unexpected during high-altitude performance trials in early 1943. The standard Curtiss electric propellers, with their narrow, elegant blades, were simply failing to convert the enormous power of the Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double WASP engine into forward thrust at combat altitudes above 25,000 feet. The physics were brutally simple yet maddeningly complex. At high altitudes where the air grew thin and cold, conventional propeller blades, designed with pre-war aerodynamic theories, couldn't bite effectively into the rarefied atmosphere. The Thunderbolt's massive engine, capable of producing 2,000 horsepower, with its turbo supercharger engaged, was essentially merely spinning a propeller through near vacuum. Engineers calculated that nearly 30% of available power was being wasted, transformed into nothing more than vibration and noise. The aircraft that American pilots nicknamed the Jug for its rotund fuselage was carrying all the muscle it needed, but lacked the proper tool to apply it. Kartveli's solution emerged from an unlikely source: paddle-wheel steamboats on the Hudson River. The wider, flatter blades used on riverboats to push through water inspired a radical redesign of the propeller geometry. Instead of the traditional narrow, tapered blades that had dominated aviation since the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk 4 decades earlier, Kartveli proposed blades that were broader at the tips, paddle-shaped, with fundamentally different chord dimensions and pitch characteristics. The concept seemed almost primitive, a step backward toward the crude propellers of the Great War era. Yet the mathematics suggested something extraordinary might happen at altitude. Throughout April and May of 1943, while Allied forces fought desperate battles across North Africa and prepared for the invasion of Sicily, a quieter revolution unfolded inside Republic Aviation's experimental hangar on Long Island. Alexander Kartveli's team worked 18-hour shifts, manufacturing prototype after prototype of the paddle blade propeller design, each iteration refined through wind tunnel testing and mathematical modeling. The challenge, wasn't simply making the blades wider. Any apprentice metalworker could accomplish that, but rather optimizing the precise blade geometry to extract maximum thrust from the thin air at combat altitudes, while maintaining controllability and avoiding catastrophic vibration issues that had plagued earlier experimental designs. The breakthrough came on the 23rd of May, according to test flight records maintained by Republic Aviation and later analyzed by the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Aeronautical Research Division. Test pilot Lowry Brabham lifted Thunderbolt serial number 4276890 off Farmingdale's runway at 0730 hours WIT. The first production-ready paddle blade propeller installed, a Curtiss electric 4-blade unit, with each blade measuring 13 feet 2 inches in diameter, significantly wider at the tips than the standard configuration. The morning air was crisp and clear, perfect for high-altitude testing, and Brabham pushed the Thunderbolt into a steep climb toward 30,000 feet, where the real evaluation would begin. What happened during that flight would fundamentally alter the tactical calculus of the air war over Europe. As Brabham later recounted in his debriefing report, archived at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, the difference between the standard and paddle blade configurations was not incremental, but transformational. At 28,000 feet, with the turbo supercharger feeding compressed air into the massive radial engine, Brabham pushed the throttle forward and felt the Thunderbolt surge ahead with an authority he'd never experienced in dozens of previous test flights. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, then 420, 440. Speeds that had been purely theoretical just months earlier for an aircraft of the Thunderbolt's weight and size. The paddle blade propeller was accomplishing exactly what Kartveli had predicted. Its broader surface area, particularly at the blade tips where rotational velocity was highest, was grabbing the thin, high-altitude air and converting the double WASP engine's prodigious power into thrust with unprecedented efficiency. Brabham dove the Thunderbolt from 30,000 feet to 15,000 feet, and the airspeed indicator touched 473 miles per hour, a speed that exceeded even the vaunted Messerschmitt 109 Gustav's maximum velocity by a comfortable margin. More importantly, the Thunderbolt reached these speeds while carrying 850 caliber machine guns, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, armor plating, and enough fuel to escort bombers deep into German territory and back, a mission profile the lighter German fighters simply couldn't match. News of the successful test spread through Republic aviation like electricity. Within 72 hours, production lines at Farmingdale were being reconfigured to accommodate the new propeller assembly. By mid-June 1943, Thunderbolts equipped with paddle blade propellers began rolling off the assembly line at a rate of nearly 200 aircraft per month. The modification added less than 50 pounds to the aircraft's empty weight, but transformed its high-altitude performance so dramatically that combat pilots who transitioned from early Thunderbolt models to paddle blade-equipped variants reported feeling like they were flying entirely different aircraft. The Jug had finally been given teeth sharp enough to match its considerable mass. On the 17th of August, 1943, a date that would become known as Black Thursday in Luftwaffe records, Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller led his Jagdgeschwader 26 into combat against a massive formation of American B-17 bombers attacking the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Priller, a veteran with over 70 Confi, Uramed kills and the Knight's Cross with oak leaves around his neck, expected another day of systematic slaughter. The heavily armed but slow American bombers had been suffering catastrophic losses throughout the summer campaign. What he didn't expect was the appearance of the new Thunderbolts, their paddle blade propellers glinting in the thin sunlight at 27,000 feet, arriving over the target area with fuel tanks still half full and pilots eager for combat. The engagement that followed shattered Germany's comfortable assumptions about American fighter capabilities. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, the first unit fully equipped with paddle blade Thunderbolts, led his pilots in a diving attack from 32,000 feet, exploiting the altitude advantage that the improved propellers now made tactic viable. The Thunderbolts fell on Priller's formation like anvils dropped from heaven, their combined weight and velocity creating kinetic energy that the lighter German fighters couldn't match. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, flying as Priller's wingman that day, later wrote in his combat diary, now preserved in the Bundesarchiv military archives in Freiburg, that the American fighters came down with the speed of meteors, and when we tried to dive away, they followed us down, matching our velocity or exceeding it. This was the crucial tactical revolution that the paddle blade propeller enabled. Previous American fighters, the P-38 Lightning and P-39 Era Cobra, had possessed certain advantages but lacked the high-altitude performance and dive characteristics necessary to consistently dominate Germany's experienced fighter pilots. The early model Thunderbolts had been better, but still not decisive. The paddle blade variants changed everything. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, where bomber escort missions were fought, the Thunderbolt could now outrun the Messerschmitt 109 Gustav in level flight, outdive it by a significant margin, and most crucially, maintain combat power and control authority at speeds that left German pilots struggling with compressibility effects and control stiffness. The engagement over Schweinfurt that August day cost the 56th Fighter Group 3 Thunderbolts, but Priller's JG-26 lost 11 Messerschmitts destroyed and 7 damaged beyond economical repair, a loss rate that was simply unsustainable. More importantly, the PR, essence of the long-range high-performance Thunderbolts, had forced German fighters to engage the escort rather than concentrate on the bombers, significantly reducing bomber losses compared to earlier unescorted missions. The after-action reports that reached Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin painted a disturbing picture. The Americans had somehow transformed their flying milk jug into a formidable air superiority fighter seemingly overnight. German intelligence services scrambled to understand what had changed. Reconnaissance photographs of Farmingdale, obtained by Abwehr agents in neutral Sweden and Switzerland, showed the Thunderbolt production lines, but revealed nothing obviously different about the aircraft's external appearance. Captured American pilots, interrogated at Dulig Luft near Frankfurt, spoke enthusiastically about improved performance, but couldn't explain technical details. Most combat pilots weren't engineers and didn't fully understand the aerodynamic principles behind the paddle blade propeller. It wasn't until September 1943, when a damaged Thunderbolt force landed near Antwerp and was captured largely intact by German forces, that Luftwaffe engineers finally understood what Republic aviation had accomplished. At the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt, the German Aviation Research Institute, in Berlin-Adlershof, a team led by Oberingenieur Wilhelm Messerschmitt himself examined the captured Thunderbolt throughout late September and early October of 1943. The paddle blade propeller was immediately removed and subjected to exhaustive analysis. Wind tunnel testing at various simulated altitudes revealed the elegant simplicity of the American solution. The broader blade chord, particularly in the outer sections of the propeller, increased the effective disk area, the total surface pushing against the air, by approximately 18% compared to standard propeller designs. This seemingly modest increase translated into dramatically improved thrust at altitude, where every additional square inch of blade surface mattered enormously. Messerschmitt's report to the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the aviation ministry, acknowledged with grudging professional respect that the Americans had solved a problem German engineers had been wrestling with for years. Germany's fighters had achieved their performance through lightweight construction and aerodynamic refinement, accepting reduced payload and range as necessary compromises. The American approach, building around a massive, powerful engine and then optimizing the propeller to extract maximum performance at altitude, represented a fundamentally different design philosophy, one that was proving devastatingly effective in the specific context of long-range bomber escort missions. The report, declassified in 1978 and now available through the Bundesarchiv, concluded that replicating the American paddle blade design would require extensive retooling of German propeller manufacturing facilities and could not be accomplished before the spring of 1944 at the earliest. This timeline was catastrophically inadequate for Germany's strategic situation. By October 1943, the combined bomber offensive was gaining momentum. American 8th Air Force bomber streams, protected by increasing numbers of paddle blade Thunderbolts, were striking industrial targets throughout occupied Europe and Germany itself. The loss rates for Luftwaffe day fighters were climbing from sustainable to critical. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, W.E. Ho, would eventually become Germany's second highest scoring ace, with 301 confirmed victories, noted in his autobiography, Stuka and Jabo Ace, that the appearance of the improved Thunderbolts in autumn 1943 marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's qualitative advantage. German pilots were still skilled and experienced, but they were increasingly fighting from positions of tactical disadvantage against American fighters that could choose when and where to engage. The German aviation industry attempted several responses to the Thunderbolt threat. Focke-Wulf's Kurt tank accelerated development of the FW-190 Dora 9, a high-altitude interceptor variant with an inline engine replacing the standard radial. Messerschmitt pushed forward with the Me-262 jet fighter program, hoping to leapfrog the Americans' technological achievement entirely. But both programs required time, precious ammo, and years that Germany's deteriorating strategic situation couldn't provide. Meanwhile, Republic Aviation was producing paddle-blade Thunderbolts at an ever-increasing rate. By the end of 1943, nearly 2,000 of the improved fighters had been delivered to combat units in Europe, and production was accelerating toward 300 aircraft per month. The strategic implications extended beyond individual combat engagements. The paddle-blade Thunderbolt's extended range, made possible by the improved propeller efficiency, which reduced fuel consumption at cruise power settings by approximately 8%, allowed American fighters to escort bombers to targets that had previously been beyond fighter rang. Berlin, Hamburg, and even targets in eastern Germany were now within the protective envelope of American fighter escorts. German industrial facilities that had operated with relative impunity during daylight hours suddenly found themselves under sustained attack. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, synthetic oil refineries in the Ruhr Valley, and aircraft manufacturing plants scattered throughout the Reich all came under increasing pressure. By January 1944, the paddle-blade Thunderbolt had become the dominant American fighter over Western Europe, equipping the 56th, 78th, and 4th Fighter Groups of the 8th Air Force, along with multiple groups in the 9th Air Force supporting tactical operations in preparation for the coming invasion of France. Colonel Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group, flying from Boxted Aerodrome in Essex, England, had become the highest-scoring fighter group in theater, with the paddle-blade Thunderbolt's performance characteristics enabling combat tactics that were simply impossible with earlier aircraft. Zemke developed what he called the roller coaster technique, approaching bomber formations at extreme altitude, often 33,000 feet or higher, where the Thunderbolt's turbocharged engine and efficient propeller provided maximum advantage, then using the aircraft's exceptional dive performance to slash through German fighter formations before zooming back to altitude. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gaby Gabreski, who would end the war as the top-scoring American ace in Europe with 28 confirmed victories, flew paddle-blade Thunderbolts throughout his combat tour with the 56th Fighter Group. In his memoir, Gaby, A Fighter Pilot's Life, published in 1991 by Orion Books, Gabreski described the paddle-blade Thun, Deerbolt, as the aircraft that won the air war over Europe. He emphasized that the propeller modification had transformed not just performance numbers, but the fundamental psychology of air combat. German pilots who had previously been able to choose whether to engage or disengage based on tactical position now found themselves trapped in combat by American fighters that could run them down in any flight regime, level flight, dive, or even in sustained climbs at altitudes above 25,000 feet. The paddle-blade propeller's impact extended beyond pure fighter-versus-fighter combat. The improved efficiency allowed Thunderbolts to carry heavier external loads, drop tanks, bombs, rockets, without sacrificing the performance necessary to defend themselves against German interceptors. Beginning in February 1944, Thunderbolt groups began conducting fighter-bomber missions, striking tactical targets throughout occupied France while retaining full capability to engage Luftwaffe fighters en route to and from targets. This dual-role capability was strategically invaluable in the months leading up to D-Day. The same aircraft that escorted bombers to Berlin in the morning could attack railway marshalling yards in France in the afternoon, then engage Luftwaffe fighters on the return flight, a mission flexibility that German single-engine fighters, optimized purely for interception, couldn't match. The Luftwaffe attempted to counter the Thunderbolt's dominance through tactical innovation rather than technological parity. Jagdgeschwader 11, led by the brilliant tactician Anton Haeckel, developed hit-and-run techniques specifically designed to minimize exposure to American fighters. German formations would climb to extreme altitude, position themselves upsun of American bomber formations, then dive through the bomber stream at maximum speed, firing brief bursts and continuing the dive to ground level rather than attempting to turn and re-engage. This approach occasionally succeeded in destroying bombers, but did nothing to contest American air superiority, and the losses German fighters suffered from diving Thunderbolts during these attacks remained prohibitive. By March 1944, German fighter pilot losses had reached crisis proportions. According to research compiled by Luftwaffe historian Bernd Barbus and published in Reichsverteidigung, the development of German day fighter tactics against the Allied bomber offensive. The average life expectancy for a newly qualified Luftwaffe fighter pilot dropped to just 37 combat sorties, barely 2 months of operational flying. The paddle-blade Thunderbolt wasn't solely responsible for this catastrophic attrition rate, but it was a major contributing factor. The aircraft had given American pilots a platform that matched or exceeded German fighters in every performance category that mattered at the altitudes where bomber escort combat occurred, and American numerical superiority was growing exponentially as production ramped up and German manufacturing infrastructure came under increasing attack. Part 6. The Normandy Crucible. On the 6th of June, 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in Operation Overlord, paddle-blade Thunderbolts provided the aerial umbrella that made the invasion possible. The 9th Air Force's fighter groups, including the 36th Fighter Group based at Kingsnorth, flew continuous patrols over the invasion beaches, establishing absolute air superiority that prevented the Luftwaffe from conducting effective reconnaissance or ground attack missions against the vulnerable landing forces. Major Glenn Duncan, commanding the 36th Fighter Group, led his Thunderbolts in missions that combined air superiority patrol with ground attack, strafing German positions and vehicles with the .850 caliber machine guns that gave the Thunderbolt devastating firepower against ground targets. The operational flexibility that paddle-blade propeller efficiency enabled was fully demonstrated during the Normandy campaign. Thunderbolts would take off from bases in southern England carrying maximum fuel and ordnance loads, often 2 1,000-pound bombs plus full ammunition. D'Union, fly combat missions over France lasting 3 to 4 hours, and return with enough fuel reserves to engage any German fighters encountered along the route. This endurance, combined with the performance to survive in contested airspace, made the Thunderbolt the perfect aircraft for the fluid, multi-role missions that characterized close air support operations during the Normandy breakout. The paddle-blade propeller's contribution to this capability was direct and measurable. The improved propeller efficiency reduced fuel consumption at typical ground attack mission profiles by approximately 6 to 7%, translating into 15 to 20 additional minutes of loiter time over the combat area. German forces in Normandy faced an aerial environment utterly dominated by Allied fighters, particularly the Thunderbolt. Oberst Josef Priller, who had led Jagdgeschwader 26 during the dark days of 1943, commanded the only 2 Luftwaffe fighters that managed to make strafing runs over the invasion beaches on D-Day itself, a heroic but ultimately futile gesture that highlighted the Luftwaffe's institutional collapse. In post-war interviews conducted by Allied intelligence services and archived at the Imperial War Museum in London, captured German officers repeatedly cited Allied air superiority, particularly the ubiquitous presence of Thunderbolts, as the decisive factor that made effective defensive operations impossible. The tactical dominance established during the Normandy campaign continued throughout the summer and fall of 1944 as Allied forces broke out of the beachhead and drove across France-Toey, or Germany's borders. Thunderbolt groups transitioned to operations from captured airfields in France, reducing transit times and allowing even more time over target areas. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's elite unit, moved to Boxted and then to forward bases in Belgium, maintaining pressure on German forces during their retreat. By September 1944, when Allied ground forces reached Germany's western frontier, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength, with experienced pilots killed or captured at a rate that far exceeded the training pipeline's ability to replace them. The paddle blade Thunderbolt's contribution to this aerial supremacy was fundamental rather than merely incremental. Without is the propeller modification. The Thunderbolt would have remained a capable but not dominant fighter, adequate for escorting bombers but lacking the decisive performance edge necessary to consistently defeat Germany's experienced pilots flying well-designed aircraft. The paddle blade configuration transformed the Thunderbolt into an aircraft that could impose its will on the aerial battlefield, choosing when and where to engage, pursuing German fighters that attempted to disengage, and maintaining combat effectiveness across a wider envelope of altitude, speed, and loading conditions than any other American fighter of the period, except perhaps the later model P-51 Mustang, which benefited from its own propeller refinements inspired by the Thunderbolt's success. The end of the war in May 1945 brought opportunities for comprehensive analysis of the technologies that had shaped the conflict's outcome. American technical intelligence teams fanning across defeated Germany discovered that Luftwaffe engineers had indeed attempted to replicate the paddle blade propeller design, but production versions incorporating the broader blade geometry didn't enter service until early 1945, far too late to affect the war's outcome. Documents recovered from the Messerschmitt Design Bureau in Augsburg revealed that German engineers had actually understood the theoretical advantages of broader propeller blades since 1941, but had lacked the metallurgical capacity to manufacture blades with the necessary strength-to-weight ratio at the wider chord dimensions. Germany's shortage of strategic materials, particularly chrome and molybdenum for high-strength steel alloys, had created a technological bottleneck that no amount of theoretical knowledge could overcome. The Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted by American analysts during 1945 and 1946, concluded that Allied air superiority over Germany had been the essential prerequisite for victory, and identified the paddle blade Thunderbolt as one of the key technological developments that enabled that superiority. The survey's aviation section, led by renowned economist John Kenneth Galbraith, calculated that the propeller modification had improved the Thunderbolt combat effectiveness by approximately 23% in high-altitude fighter versus fighter engagements, and by 16% in fighter-bomber missions, improvements that translated directly into reduced bomber losses and increased pressure on German industrial production. These seemingly modest percentage improvements, when multiplied across thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of combat sorties, had enormous cumulative strategic impact. Alexander Kartveli, the engineer whose insight had initiated the paddle blade development, received relatively little public recognition during the war. Aviation engineering was a collaborative endeavor involving hundreds of specialists, and individual contributions were difficult to isolate. However, within the aviation engineering community, Kartveli's achievement was well understood and appreciated. In 1948, he received the Daniel Guggenheim Medal, aviation's highest engineering honor, specifically citing his work on the Thunderbolt's propeller optimization. The medal citation noted that Kartveli's practical application of advanced aerodynamic principles to propeller design under combat conditions demonstrated engineering excellence that directly contributed to Allied victory in the European Air War. Post-war analysis also revealed just how close-run the technological competition had been. If Germany had possessed adequate strategic materials and manufacturing capacity to implement paddle blade-style propellers on its fighters even 6 months earlier than it did, the air war's trajectory might have been significantly different. the Focke-Wulf FDU-190 Door, a 9 and the late-model Messerschmitt Bf-109 Kurt, when equipped with improved propellers, demonstrated performance closely matching the paddle-blade Thunderbolt in limited testing conducted by Allied technical intelligence teams using captured aircraft. But Germany never had 6 months. By the time these improved German aircraft entered service, Allied numerical superiority was so overwhelming that individual technological parity was strategically irrelevant. The paddle-blade propeller concept itself became standard practice in post-war aviation. American aircraft manufacturers incorporated broader chord propeller blades as baseline design features in new aircraft developments during the late 1940s. The Douglas A-1 Skyraider, designed immediately after the war as a carrier-based attack aircraft, featured propeller geometry directly influenced by the Thunderbolt's paddle blade configuration. British aircraft manufacturers, studying captured German analysis of American propeller technology, adopted similar design principles for post-war aircraft like the Hawker Sea Fury. Even the Soviet Union, which obtained complete examples of late-war American aircraft through Lend-Lease deliveries, incorporated paddle-blade propeller geometry into fighters like the Lavochkin Le-9 and Le-11 that emerged in the immediate post-war period. 75 years after the end of the Second World War, historians and aviation enthusiasts continue to debate which technological innovations were most decisive in determining the conflict's outcome. Radar, the proximity fuse, the atomic bomb. These are the technologies that typically dominate popular narratives. Yet for those who study the European air war in detail, the paddle blade propeller occupies a unique position. A modification so simple it seems almost trivial, yet one that fundamentally altered the tactical balance at a critical moment in the war. Warren Boddy, whose exhaustive research into Republic aviation's history remains the definitive work on the subject, wrote that the paddle blade propeller gave American fighter pilots the tool they needed to dominate German airspace at precisely the moment when such dominance became strategically essential. The Thunderbolt's transformation from capable fighter to air superiority weapon illustrates a broader truth about technological competition in warfare. Marginal improvements can have non-linear effects when they occur at critical inflection points. The paddle blade propeller improved Thunderbolt performance by perhaps 15 to 25%, depending on specific altitude and loading conditions, significant but not revolutionary in pure engineering terms. However, this improvement occurred exactly when the combined bomber offensive was reaching its decisive phase, when German fighter pilot quality was beginning to decline due to catastrophic losses, and when American industrial production was reaching maximum output. The confluence of these factors transformed a marginal performance advantage into overwhelming tactical dominance. For the men who flew the paddle-blade Thunderbolts, the technical details mattered less than the confidence the aircraft inspired. Robert Johnson, who scored 27 victories flying Thunderbolts with the 56th Fighter Group and survived being hit by enemy fire on numerous occasions, wrote in his memoir, Thunderbolt, that the aircraft could take punishment that would destroy any other fighter and still bring you home. The paddle blade propeller contribute to this survivability indirectly by giving pilots the performance needed to avoid taking hits in the first place, to disengage from unfavorable combat situations, and to escort damaged bombers that limped home at reduced speeds and altitudes. The psychological impact of flying an aircraft that could reliably outperform enemy fighters in the mission-critical altitude band was incalculable but real. Germany never expected the paddle blade propeller to transform the Thunderbolt because German engineering philosophy had evolved along different paths. Focused on weight reduction and aerodynamic refinement, Luftwaffe engineers had created fighters that were marvels of efficiency, but lacked the margin for improvement that the American brute force approach, big engine, HE, EV airframe, optimize everything else provided. The paddle blade propeller was possible precisely because Republic Aviation had built a fighter around an engine so powerful that it could absorb the additional drag of wider propeller blades and still achieve superior performance. This design philosophy, distinctly American in its willingness to accept size and complexity in exchange for capability and survivability, would shape American combat aviation for generations. Today, the surviving paddle-blade Thunderbolts preserved in museums around the world stand as monuments to the engineering ingenuity that helped win the Second World War. The National Air and Space Museum's Thunderbolt, restored to its original paddle-blade configuration, draws visitors who marvel at the aircraft's massive radial engine and broad-bladed propeller. Few of those visitors understand the specific technical innovations that made the aircraft lethal, but they recognize instinctively that this was a machine built to dominate. In the vast, complex tapestry of technological developments that determined the war's outcome, the paddle-blade propeller was a single thread, but it was a thread that ran through countless individual combat engagements, binding together American industrial might, engineering innovation, and pilot courage into a combination that Germany, for all its initial technological sophistication, ultimately could not match. The transformation of the Thunderbolt from promising design to 470-mile-per-hour monster proved that in warfare, as in engineering, sometimes the simplest solutions are the most profound.